Today I want to show you 3 ways to use masking to take your film emulation to the next level inside of Lightroom. I'm gonna start with a really simple one that I use on most of my photos and then level up to progressively more complex ideas. But first, hi, my name is Vlad, I'm a portrait photographer and Lightroom nerd, and I spent the last few years developing tools for Lightroom so I wouldn't have to go to Photoshop or any other third-party plugins to emulate film in my photos. And a lot of my tools are actually based on Lightroom masking. And I'm not even talking about AI enhanced masking. I'm talking about simple, radial gradients, linear gradients, or just luminosity based masks that can help us get to the next level with our edits without having to leave Lightroom. So let's jump into it and talk about the first simple mask. And for this first tip, I'm gonna be using this self-portrait that I took a while ago while trying to figure out if the gray sweatshirt or a gray wristband are good enough for white balancing your photos. And no, they're not, but we're not talking about that today. Today, we're talking about exposure and how our eyes are usually expecting bright stuff to be on the upper part on the image, while on the bottom part, we're usually expecting to see shadows. But because of the way the light was bouncing in this photo, you can see that my shirt over here creates quite a large highlight spot in the middle of the photo on the bottom part. And we can see that even better if I switch to my false color view, where we have a huge bright spot over here and one more on my arm to the left, while my face is pretty much in shadow. And to address that, I'm going to push up my exposure a bit more, just enough to have gray tones on my face in false color. And when I'm switching back to Adobe Color, you can see that although my face has better exposure, the lower part of the photo is even more distracting and it looks really bad right now. So here comes the masking. Create a new mask, radial gradient, and I'm gonna be covering the lower part of the image with a large radial gradient that's gonna have its middle part sit right against the edge of the frame. Something like this, maybe a bit bigger. And in this radial gradient, I'm going to push down my exposure quite significantly and also lower the highlights and the contrast so it looks less distracting. And I'm gonna do the same for the arm on the left with a big radial gradient. Again, starting from the edge of the frame, I'm going to put it lower so it doesn't cover the upper part of the arm. And again, I'm pushing down the highlights and the exposure just enough so it doesn't look distracting anymore. And we can check this in false color by switching to the false color camera profile. The arm is still a bit too bright, so I'm going to push this even further with the mount slider. A little bit of something like this, but as we can see, I created a zone over here where the two masks are overlapping. So from this one, I'm going to subtract another radial gradient just to make sure that I'm not creating super dark zones or pretty much contrast that's distracting from the face in the photo. And now let's go back to Adobe Color and toggle my masking on and off and see what effect they had on the photo. And when I put the images side by side like this, I don't even think I need to say anything more. So the first trick here is to create a large darker area on the bottom part of the photo, making it basically less interesting for our eyes so our eyes can focus on the subject. And we can double down on this effect in Lightroom by creating a large radial gradient on the upper part of the photo and bumping the exposure up just a tiny bit, probably 0.3 or at most half a stop is gonna be good enough. But we also have to pay attention that we don't cook our highlights on the face of the subject or that we don't blow out the sky. So use this with caution. And by now you're probably asking yourself, what the hell does this have to do with film emulation? Well, because of the way film handle highlights, it got a bit bloomy around the brighter areas in the photo. And that meant that the upper part of the image where we had the sky, well, it also got a bit brighter. So this both improves our composition and makes the photo look a bit more like film. Keep in mind, it's the small things that matter, regardless of what your girlfriend told you. Now, let's go back to tip number 2, which is gonna have a bit more of an impact. And for this example, I'm gonna use this portrait of my body right here, which you can see it was shot on a pretty vintage lens. You can tell that because of the swirliness of the bokeh and also because of the sharpness drop off that's happening from the center towards the edges of the photo. Just that drop off, it's actually a mask that I created and that's using a radial gradient. So let's delete the mask and I'm going to recreate the effect from scratch so you know exactly what I did in that mask. And I'm going to start with a large radial gradient starting from the middle of the photo. I'm going to keep it pretty round and also super big. And I'm going to invert the mask so it only affects the edges of the photo. Now, inside of this mask, I'm going to lower the sharpness pretty significantly to around -70 and also lower clarity and texture to get rid of the details inside of my mask. And if I toggle it right now, you can already tell that we're losing some details in the corners. And to push this even further, I'm going to use negative dehaze to around -40. But this also brought up the luminance values in the area, so I'm going to use the exposure slider to tone that back down. Let's toggle it on and off and see how I'm doing for exposure. Maybe I exaggerated a bit. Let's see. Yeah, this looks pretty good. But right now, I also lost a ton of contrast and I don't like how washed out the corner is. So I'm going to pull down my shadows a bit more, but raise the black point just a bit and also bump up my midtones just a tiny bit more. But you can also play with the contrast and maybe reduce the contrast towards the edges of the frame if you don't have things like extreme highlights or super deep shadows like I have right here. Or also you can play with the highlights and shadows in order to get a more flatted look towards the edges of the frame. And if I toggle off and off the mask right now, you can see how little details and sharpness there are in this edge right here compared to what we had before, where the highlights were pretty distracting. And of course, we can also adjust the size and the shape of the mask to simulate various lenses. And with that in place, I think there's one more thing that fits this image super well, and that's applying some black bars or letterboxing with just one click inside of Lightroom. And yes, this is an ad for one of my products. As you just saw, with one click I can apply black bars or white borders to any photo that I have right here. And this tool is also using a mask. And you can learn more about borders or black bars directly in Lightroom by checking out the Lightroom preset shop on my website. Now let's go back to tip number 3, and that's adding a bit of bloom into your photos directly in Lightroom. But keep in mind, this is not going to work on any photo. This one is the perfect candidate because it has all these small highlights in the background. So what I'm gonna do is create a new radial gradient mask, which is gonna be really big to cover the upper part of the image, but I'm going to subtract from it a AI subject mask. And now I have this mask, which I'm going to intersect with a luminance range mask. And I'm doing that because I don't want to affect the shadows in this photo. So I'm going to click on highlight, and the luminance mask did this, which is good, but it's selecting just the highlights, and I mostly want to target the midtones right next to them. So I'm manually adjusting the luminance range so it avoids the brightest areas of the highlights, but targeting the midtones right next to them. And with the mask created, what I'm gonna do is scroll down and set the texture to around -70 or around that value, and also put the sharpness to around -60 or a bit more. And just like that, we created a bit of blur around our highlights. And we can take this even further by using the tone curve and pushing the midtones up just a tiny bit. And this is pretty much the entire mask, which created a bit of bloom in our photos with a really subtle effect in just a few clicks. And I'm gonna be the first to admit that this method has a few limitations, and that's exactly the reason why I didn't turn this into a product on my website. But it's a nice tool to have if you wanna add just that little bit of bloom to your photos and can make some highlights look a lot more natural, especially in the places where you've blown out your sky. And to show you this in action, I've come back to the first photo where you can see that I've got some really ugly edges where the sky meets the mountain behind of me in both of those corners. Let's zoom out, and I'm gonna enable a mask that's similar to the one that I created before. And with just this simple mask, you can see that the edges are no longer that jarring, and we got that little bit of bloom in the photo that looks a bit more like film. And while using this technique, I would encourage you to avoid using the clarity slider too much, because while negative clarity can make parts of the image really dreamy, it can also turn your highlights into muddy messes. So use that with caution. And if you want to push this technique to the next level, you can grab a brush mask. Let's paint on my face over here and on my chest. Let's enable overlay so you can see what I'm doing. I'm doing a really rough mask because I know that I'm going to be intersecting it with a luminance range. I'm going to click on the forehead to select the highlights and adjust it just a tiny bit so it includes the midtones. And I think that's my mask right here. And in this mask, I'm going to pop my midtones up a bit, lower the sharpness, but because I'm doing it on the subject of the photo, not that drastically, and also lower the texture to around -40. And if I toggle this mask on and off, the effect is super subtle, but you can see that I got just that bit of bloom similar to a black mist filter that's pretty low in intensity. And that's it for today. Those were 3 techniques that help me get better edits in my photo and hopefully are gonna help you as well. If you like what I'm doing, make sure to hit subscribe for more advanced Lightroom tutorials and photography stuff in general. And maybe if you think this is helpful, share it with a friend because that helps me out a lot. Don't forget to check out my preset store. The link is in the description down below. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!